On the morning Claire Bennet was meant to marry the wealthiest man their small town had ever known, she stood at the altar of his sprawling estate, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to keep them still. The chapel was silent except for the rustle of expensive fabric and the occasional cough from one of the 100 guests who had come to witness what many were calling the wedding of the decade. But it wasn't admiration in their eyes. It was suspicion, doubt, and something else Claire couldn't quite name. Her groom, Michael Hartwell, sat before her in his wheelchair, his face unreadable, his grey eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The priest had just opened his mouth to begin the vows when Michael's hand shot out and gripped Claire's wrist. Not gently, not romantically, but with a desperation that made every person in that room rise slightly from their seats. And then, in front of God and everyone who had come to judge her, Michael Hartwell did something no one had seen him do in over 3 years. He stood up, but this is not where the story begins. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened at that altar, to understand why a poor girl from a forgotten town found herself at the center of a mystery that would unravel a family's darkest secrets, we have to go back 6 months, back to when Claire Bennet was just trying to survive, and Michael Hartwell was a man the world had already decided was broken beyond repair. Who was Claire Bennet, really? Just another struggling waitress, or someone destined for something bigger? And why would a wealthy man in a wheelchair, a man who could have chosen anyone, pick her? What secrets was the Hartwell family hiding behind their mansion walls? And what happened at that altar that would expose lies buried for years? This is the story of how 2 wounded souls collided in the most unexpected way, and how one moment of truth would change everything. This is the story of Claire and Michael, and nothing about it is what you think. Claire Bennet grew up in Riverside, a small town 2 hours north of the city, where everyone knew your name and your business before you even turned 16. She was the kind of girl people described as sweet, hard-working, and unassuming. She had honey-colored hair that she usually kept tied back in a ponytail, hazel eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and a quiet strength that came from years of watching her mother work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Claire's father had left when she was 7, and her mother, Margaret, had raised her alone in a 2-bedroom rental that smelled like lavender and old wood. Claire had learned early on that dreams were luxuries people like her couldn't afford. So she worked. She waitressed at the diner on Main Street, cleaned houses on weekends, and saved every dollar she could in a shoebox under her bed. She had no illusions about her future. She would work until her hands were raw, maybe marry someone decent from town, and repeat the cycle her mother had lived. That was just how life went for people like them. Michael Hartwell was a different story entirely. Once, he had been the golden boy of the county. Handsome, successful, charming, the kind of man who lit up every room he walked into. He had taken over his family's real estate company at 25 and turned it into an empire. People loved him, they wanted to be near him, to bask in his success and charisma. But 3 years ago, everything changed. Michael was in a terrible car accident. The details were murky. Different people told different versions of the story, but the result was the same. Michael Hartwell, the man who had everything, was left paralyzed from the waist down. He retreated from public life, became a ghost in his own mansion. The vibrant, confident man everyone knew disappeared, replaced by someone quiet, withdrawn, and broken. Rumors swirled through the county. Some said he had been drinking. Others whispered that it wasn't an accident at all, that something darker had happened that night. But no one knew for sure, and Michael wasn't talking. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late March when Claire's life changed forever. She was finishing her shift at the diner, wiping down tables and counting her tips, when a black car pulled up outside. Not just any car. A sleek, expensive sedan with tinted windows and chrome detailing that reflected the afternoon sun like a mirror. Claire watched through the window as a man in a tailored suit stepped out, glanced at a piece of paper in his hand, and walked into the diner. He looked out of place, like a penguin in a desert. He ordered a coffee, black, And when Claire brought it to him, he looked up at her with sharp, assessing eyes. "Are you Claire Bennett?" he asked. She nodded slowly, unsure why this stranger knew her name. He introduced himself as David Moreno, an attorney representing the Hartwell family. Claire had heard the name Hartwell before, everyone in the county had, but she had never met any of them. They were old money, the kind of family that owned half the businesses in the region and lived in a mansion that looked like something out of a movie. David slid a crisp white envelope across the table. "My client would like to meet with you," he said simply. Claire stared at the envelope like it might explode. "Why?" she asked. David didn't answer. He just finished his coffee, left a $20 bill on the table, and walked out. Inside the envelope was an address, a date, and a time. Nothing else. Claire didn't tell her mother about the envelope, not at first. She spent 3 days turning it over in her mind, trying to figure out what a family like the Hartwells could possibly want with someone like her. She thought about ignoring it, about throwing the envelope away and pretending it had never happened. But curiosity got the better of her. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the desperate, quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, something in her life was about to change. So on Saturday morning, Claire borrowed her neighbor's car and drove to the address on the envelope. The Hartwell estate was even more intimidating in person. It sat at the end of a long, tree-lined driveway, a sprawling manor with white columns and perfectly manicured gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Claire felt her stomach twist as she parked and walked up to the front door. A housekeeper answered, an older woman with kind eyes and a soft smile, and led Claire through hallways filled with oil paintings and antique furniture. They stopped in front of a set of double doors. The housekeeper knocked once, then pushed them open. The room inside was a study, all dark wood and leather-bound books, and in the center of it, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, was Michael Hartwell. Claire had seen pictures of him before, years ago, back when he was still the golden boy of the county. Handsome, successful, charming. But the man in front of her now looked like a shadow of that person. His dark hair was longer than it had been in the photos, falling just past his ears. His jaw was sharp and unshaven, and his gray eyes were tired, haunted even. He didn't smile when he saw her, he just gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit," he said. His voice was low, rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. Claire sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Michael studied her for a long moment, and she felt like he was trying to see straight through her. "I need you to do something for me," he said finally. Claire waited. "I need you to marry me." The words hung in the air like smoke. Claire blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me," she said. Michael leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "I know how this sounds. But I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for romance or forever. I'm asking for a business arrangement. 6 months, you marry me, you live here, you play the part of my wife in public. In return, I'll pay you $200,000. Enough to change your life. Enough to take care of your mother. Enough to finally breathe." Claire felt like the room was spinning. $200,000. It was more money than she had ever imagined seeing in her entire life. But nothing about this made sense. Why her? Why this arrangement? What was he hiding? She asked the first question that came to mind. "Why me?" Michael looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because you're not from this world. You don't know the people I know. You won't ask the wrong questions. And because I've had you looked into. You're kind. You're honest. And you need the money." Claire should have been offended by that. She should have stood up and walked out. But she didn't. Because he was right. She did need the money. Her mother's health was failing, the medical bills were piling up, and Claire was drowning. This was a lifeline. A strange, confusing, potentially dangerous lifeline, but a lifeline nonetheless. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. Michael's expression darkened. "That's not part of the deal." Claire nodded slowly. She should have said no. Every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to say no. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, "I'll do it." The next few weeks were a blur. Claire signed papers she barely understood, met with lawyers who spoke in legal jargon that made her head spin, and tried to explain to her mother why she was suddenly engaged to a man she had only met once. Margaret Bennet was skeptical at first, worried even, but when Claire explained the money, the opportunity, her mother's resistance softened. "Just promise me you'll be careful," Margaret said, holding her daughter's hands tightly. "Promise me you'll come home if something feels wrong." Claire promised, even though she wasn't entirely sure she could keep that promise. The wedding was planned quickly, quietly, with none of the fanfare that usually accompanied a Hartwell event. Michael's family was another story entirely. Claire met them 2 weeks before the wedding, at a tense dinner in the Manor's formal dining room. There was Eleanor Hartwell, Michael's mother, a tall, elegant woman with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. She looked at Claire like she was something unpleasant she had found on the bottom of her shoe. Then there was Richard Hartwell, Michael's older brother, who was charming and polite in a way that felt rehearsed. His wife, Vanessa, smiled at Claire, but it didn't reach her eyes. And finally, there was Sophie, Michael's younger sister, who was the only one who seemed genuinely warm. She squeezed Claire's hand under the table and whispered, "Don't let them scare you, they're just protecting him." But protecting him from what? That was the question that kept Claire awake at night. Because the more time she spent in the Hartwell house, the more she realized that something was very, very wrong. Michael was distant, rarely speaking to her outside of necessary conversations. He spent most of his days in his study or his room, and Claire quickly learned not to disturb him. But it wasn't just Michael, the whole house felt off. The staff whispered in corners and went silent when she walked by. Doors were locked at odd hours, and twice, Claire could have sworn she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room late at night, even though she knew Michael's room was on the other side of the house. One evening, about a week before the wedding, Claire was walking past the library when she heard voices. She stopped, recognizing Richard's voice immediately. "This is a mistake," he was saying. "You're putting everything at risk." Michael's reply was quieter, harder to hear. "I know what I'm doing, do you?" Richard shot back. "Because, from where I'm standing, you're playing a dangerous game. And when it blows up in your face, it's not just you who's going to suffer." Claire's heart pounded. She knew she shouldn't be listening, but she couldn't move. What was Michael hiding? What game was he playing? And why did she feel like she had just walked into the middle of something much bigger than a simple marriage arrangement? That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the conversation in her head, trying to piece together what it meant. Around midnight, she heard it. Footsteps, not in the hallway this time, but somewhere below her room. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Claire sat up in bed, her pulse racing. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving in a rhythm that sounded almost like pacing. She thought about ignoring it, about pulling the covers over her head and pretending she hadn't heard anything. But she couldn't. She had to know. Claire slipped out of bed, grabbed the small flashlight she kept on her nightstand, and opened her door as quietly as she could. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight through the windows. She followed the sound of the footsteps down the grand staircase, through the foyer, and toward the back of the house. The footsteps stopped near the door to Michael's study. Claire's hand hovered over the doorknob. She knew she shouldn't open it. She knew this was crossing a line, but she turned the handle anyway. The study was empty, completely empty. No Michael, no footsteps, just silence. But on the desk, illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window, was a folder. Claire walked over to it, her hands shaking. Inside were medical reports, dozens of them, all with Michael's name at the top. She scanned the pages, her confusion growing with every word. The reports were from 3 years ago, right after the accident that had supposedly left Michael paralyzed. But as Claire read further, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The final report, dated 6 months after the accident, stated clearly that Michael Hartwell had regained full mobility. He could walk. He had been able to walk for over 2 years. Claire stumbled back from the desk, her mind reeling. Why would he lie? Why would he pretend to be paralyzed when he wasn't? What was he hiding from? Or who was he hiding from? She heard a noise behind her and spun around, her heart in her throat. Michael was standing in the doorway, not in his wheelchair, standing. His expression was unreadable. but there was something in his eyes that looked almost like relief. "You found out," he said quietly. Claire's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Why?" Michael stepped into the room, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something raw and vulnerable in his face. "Because if my family knew I could walk, I'd be dead within a week." And now, Claire realized, she wasn't just part of a marriage arrangement. She was part of something far more dangerous, something that could get them both killed. The days leading up to the wedding were tense. Michael finally told Claire the truth, or at least part of it. 3 years ago, he had been in a car accident. It hadn't been random. Someone had tampered with his brakes, someone close to him. He had survived, but barely, and when he woke up in the hospital, his lawyer had advised him to let everyone believe he was paralyzed. It was the only way to keep him safe, to make whoever had tried to kill him think they had succeeded in neutralizing him. "But why?" Claire asked. "Why would someone in your own family want you dead?" Michael's jaw tightened. "Money. Control. My father's will left the majority of the estate to me. Richard has always resented that. He thought he deserved it more. And my mother, she's always been more loyal to Richard than to me. I couldn't prove anything, couldn't accuse anyone without evidence. So, I played the part. I let them think I was broken. And I've been gathering evidence ever since." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "So, where do I fit into this?" Michael looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something almost like guilt in his eyes. "I needed someone on the outside. Someone they wouldn't suspect. Someone who could watch, listen, and help me find the proof I need. I'm sorry, Claire. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. But I was running out of time, and I was desperate." Claire should have been angry. She should have demanded to leave, to walk away from this mess before it consumed her. But instead, she found herself asking, "What do you need me to do?" Over the next few days, Claire became Michael's eyes and ears. She paid attention to conversations at family dinners, noted who came and went from the house, and kept track of anything that seemed unusual. The Hartwell family continued their charade. Eleanor grew colder toward Claire with each passing day, making snide comments about her background and questioning whether she truly understood what it meant to be part of their family. Richard remained outwardly charming, but Claire noticed the way he watched Michael, the way his eyes followed his brother's wheelchair with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Vanessa was more direct in her disdain, barely bothering to hide her contempt for the poor girl who had somehow infiltrated their world. Only Sophie remained kind, though Claire could see the worry in the younger woman's eyes. It was Sophie who finally gave her the breakthrough. The younger Hartwell sister found Claire in the garden 2 days before the wedding. "You know, don't you?" Sophie said softly. "About Michael?" Claire nodded. Sophie looked relieved. "I've known for months. I saw him walking late one night, and he made me promise not to tell anyone. He said it wasn't safe." Claire studied the younger woman. "Do you know who tried to hurt him?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I have my suspicions, but I've been too afraid to say anything. Richard has always been ambitious, but after the accident, he changed. He became colder, more calculating. And Vanessa, his wife, she's been pressuring him to take control of the company. I heard them arguing once. She said Michael was a liability, that he was standing in the way of their future." Claire felt her stomach turn. "Does your mother know?" Sophie shook her head. "My mother only sees what she wants to see. She's always favored Richard. I think she's convinced herself that Michael's condition is some kind of punishment, that he brought it on himself. It's easier for her to believe that, than to accept that someone in this family is capable of murder." Claire felt trapped in a web of lies and danger that grew tighter every day. At night, she would lie awake in her room, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davis, the kind woman who had first welcomed her, began leaving small notes under her door. "Be careful. Watch your back. They're listening." The warnings were vague but chilling. Claire began to understand that Michael wasn't the only one who knew the truth about this family. The staff had seen things, heard things, but they were too afraid to speak up. One afternoon, Claire found herself alone in the library, searching through old family photo albums that Sophie had mentioned. She wanted to understand the Hartwells better, to see if there were any clues hidden in their history. What she found was a family that had always been fractured. In the old photos, Michael stood apart, often alone or with his father, while Richard was always at Eleanor's side. The favoritism was obvious even in photographs from decades ago. Claire's mother called her that evening, asking how she was holding up. Claire wanted to tell her everything, to confess that she was in over her head, that she was scared. But she heard the hope in Margaret's voice when she talked about the money, about the medical treatments she could finally afford, about the possibility of a future without constant struggle. So, Claire lied. She said everything was fine, that the wedding would be beautiful, that she was happy. It was the first time she had ever lied to her mother, and it felt like swallowing glass. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching." Let's see the real fans. The night before the wedding, Claire couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Sophie had said, about the danger Michael was in, about the role she had agreed to play. Around 2 in the morning, she heard her door creak open. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, and saw Michael standing in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said. They went down to his study, and Michael closed the door behind them. "Tomorrow, at the altar, I'm going to stand up," he said. "I'm going to reveal the truth in front of everyone." Claire's eyes widened. "Why? Why now?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "Because I have the proof I need. I found the emails, the bank transfers, everything that ties Richard and Vanessa to the accident. But if I reveal it quietly, they'll find a way to cover it up. They have too much power, too many connections. The only way to expose them is to do it publicly, in front of witnesses who can't be silenced or bought." Claire felt her pulse quicken. "That's incredibly dangerous." "I know," Michael said. "But it's the only way. And I need you there. I need you to stand with me. Not because of the money, not because of the arrangement, but because I trust you, and because you're the only person in this whole mess who hasn't lied to me." Claire looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the weight he had been carrying for years. The loneliness, the fear, the determination. She reached out and took his hand. "I'll be there," she said. "Whatever happens, I'll be there." The morning of the wedding arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat. Claire stood in front of the mirror in her room, staring at her reflection in the simple white dress the Hartwells had chosen for her. She looked like a stranger to herself. The housekeeper, the kind woman who had welcomed her on that first day, came in to help her with her veil. "You're a brave girl," the woman said softly, "braver than most." Claire wanted to ask what she meant, but before she could, there was a knock at the door. It was time. The chapel was filled with people Claire didn't know, all dressed in expensive clothes and wearing expressions that ranged from curious to openly hostile. She walked down the aisle slowly, her eyes locked on Michael, who sat in his wheelchair at the altar, his face a mask of calm. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests of the chair. The priest began the ceremony, his voice droning on about love and commitment and forever. Claire barely heard him. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. And then, just as the priest was about to ask for the vows, Michael moved. He gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white, and he pushed himself up. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. The chapel erupted. Gasps, whispers. Someone in the back row screamed. Michael's mother stood up, her face pale. Richard was on his feet, his expression a mix of shock and fury. Michael held up a hand, and the room fell silent. "For 3 years," he said, his voice carrying through the chapel like a thunderclap, "I have let you all believe I was broken. I let you think I was weak, helpless, dependent, but I wasn't. I've been watching, I've been waiting, and I've been gathering the truth." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "Inside here is evidence that my accident 3 years ago was not an accident. It was attempted murder, and the people responsible are standing in this room right now." The room exploded again, but Michael kept talking. His voice was steady, unwavering. "My brother, Richard, and his wife, Vanessa, hired someone to tamper with my car. They wanted me dead so they could take control of my inheritance, of this family's company. They thought they had succeeded. They thought I would spend the rest of my life in this chair, powerless and silent. But they were wrong. Richard lunged forward, but 2 security guards Michael had secretly hired stepped in front of him. "You can't prove any of this," Richard snarled. Michael smiled coldly. "Actually, I can. I have emails, bank transfers, testimony from the mechanic they bribed. It's all here, and as of this morning, it's all been turned over to the police." Vanessa tried to run, but the guards blocked the exits. Eleanor Hartwell stood frozen, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. Michael turned to Claire, and for the first time that day, his expression softened. "I brought you into this," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry. You didn't deserve to be dragged into my family's mess. But you stayed, you stood by me, and I'll never forget that." The aftermath was chaos. Richard and Vanessa were arrested that afternoon. The evidence Michael had collected was overwhelming, and within weeks, they were both facing charges for attempted murder and conspiracy. Eleanor Hartwell retreated into seclusion, unable to face the scandal that had destroyed her family's reputation. Sophie stayed close to Michael, helping him navigate the legal battles and the media frenzy that followed. And Claire stayed too. Not because of the money, though Michael insisted she take every penny he had promised her. She stayed because somewhere in the middle of the lies and the danger and the fear, she had found something real. She had found someone who saw her, truly saw her, and valued her for who she was. In the weeks following the revelation, Claire and Michael spent hours talking, really talking, about their childhoods, their fears, their dreams. Michael told her about the pressure of being the golden child, the weight of expectations that had crushed him long before the accident ever happened. Claire told him about growing up poor, about the shame she had carried for years, about feeling invisible in a world that only noticed people with money and status. They were broken in different ways, but somehow, their broken pieces fit together. Michael used his recovery and the public attention to transform the family business. He established programs for small business owners, created scholarships for kids from towns like Riverside, and turned the Hartwell name into something associated with justice rather than just wealth. Claire went back to school, something she had always dreamed of but never thought possible. She studied social work, determined to help other girls like her who felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Her mother's health improved with proper medical care, and Margaret moved into a small cottage on the Hartwell estate, where she spent her days gardening and finally, for the first time in her life, resting. Sophie became Claire's closest friend, and together they worked on a foundation to support women escaping dangerous situations. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davis, admitted that she had known about Michael's secret for months and had been leaving Claire warnings because she was terrified of what Richard might do if he discovered the truth. 6 months later, on a quiet evening in the Hartwell garden, Michael asked Claire a question. Not as part of an arrangement, not as a business deal, but as a man who had fallen in love with the woman who had saved his life in more ways than one. "Will you marry me?" he asked, this time for real. Claire smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, "this time, yes." And as they stood together under the stars, 2 people who had started as strangers brought together by desperation and circumstance, they realized that sometimes the most unexpected connections are the ones that change everything. Sometimes, the person you never saw coming is the one who saves you. And sometimes, love finds you in the most unlikely places, when you're not even looking for it. When a pure heart walks into a dark place, even shadows must bow. Claire's courage didn't just save Michael. It exposed a truth that had been buried for years, freed an entire household from the poison of lies, and proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay when everything in you wants to run. So, let me ask you this. If you were in Claire's position, would you have stayed? Would you have walked into that danger, knowing what was at stake? What do you think it takes for someone to risk everything for the truth? And do you believe Michael's recovery was destiny, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about courage, truth, and unexpected love. Because stories like this remind us that even in the darkest moments, there's always a choice. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is choose to stay. Subscribe for more timeless, emotional stories every day, only on Folktale Journal. Until next time, remember that your life can change in a moment. And when it does, the question isn't whether you're ready. It's whether you're brave enough to see it through.